Interestingly, the Stour is an example of a river that we can canoe down. When I was making my programme, I was rather staggered to find that 95% of rivers in England and Wales are privately owned. You are not allowed to canoe down them. They're owned by fishermen, largely, fishing groups, and they run a system which basically says we own the land to the middle of the river on either side, whoever owns it, and they're talking about statute, and that's why we own the river. And if you come down in your canoe, you will disturb our fish. Now, this is not the case in Scotland. In Scotland, you have a right to paddle wherever you want to go, and they have quite a large fishing, sport fishing industry and tourist industry in Scotland. They collect a lot of salmon and make a lot of money from, particularly from rich bankers who go up there to fly fish for salmon. And for some reason, everybody lives in accordance up in Scotland, but in Britain we have a privatised system. Now, the reason I mention that is because it was a group of concerned citizens in the 1970s who said, we will not have the Stour closed off. It is a navigable river. The Water Authority decided that they wanted, as they took control of the river, they said, no, we're going to have this river for ourselves. We want to ban all amenity use of this river. This is water that actually is pumped from the Great Ouse and goes into the river and is taken down the Great Ouse, pumped out to Higham and goes out to put fresh drinking water into Woolford and much of North London. And at that point, when the Water Authority in the post-war period said, we want complete control of this river and we want to stop anybody fishing in it or paddling down it or whatever. And they took it to the High Court. It was quite a famous fight. Now, these were concerned, ordinary, volunteer citizens who did this. They opened it up, and of course, it's a perfectly creditable water. When you're going down there, you are effectively paddling down a water main of one kind, an open water main. But there I was on the Stour, celebrating this lighter and celebrating a voluntary group, an amenity group, who had stepped forward and done an enormous amount of work to preserve and make this river into something which collectively we owned. Some people, if you like, who needed saluting and supporting, because their ideas and their work have added to the enjoyment of the entire country and protected for all of us, for a benefit, not just for elitists. Dozens of people every year take part in this, from the Sudbury to the sea. Many people punt on it and row on it through Constable country. It's something, an amenity, which we can all enjoy. On Monday, with Civic Voice, we went to see Nick Bowles at an APPG, which I had no idea what that was until I got there. It's an all-party parliamentary group, which has been instituted by Stephen, who is the chief executive of Civic Voice, in order for politicians who might turn up to begin, members of Parliament, to hear a little bit about some of the work that was being done. And we sat with Nick Bowles. He very kindly came along, the planning minister, to talk to us and to various members of Civic Voice. And we sat in Portcullis House and talked a bit about neighbourhood planning. This is another aspect, a modern aspect of volunteer work. Because you may be aware that David Cameron has recently, in this government, made a big hoo-ha and a big move to recognise voluntary work. The big society, do you remember that? To say that amenity groups and civic societies should be encouraged as part of the community, and for the community to step forward and make a neighbourhood plan. We discussed some of the details of how a neighbourhood plan could be made. We also pointed out to Nick Bowles that this is a slightly complex thing for us to understand, because if we're all going to go away as voluntary groups and work hard on our neighbourhood plan and put together a vision of the area in which we live and how we think planning is going to go, what is the point of doing that if Mr. Pickles is free to call in anything that he wants? He's expanded the range of things that he can call in from being things in the national interest or even sustainability, which, as we know, is a word which is quite difficult to define, even for the government. Many people have got up in Parliament and said, I wonder if the Right Honourable Member would give us a definition of what he means by sustainability, and that has been sidestepped quite successfully. I was interested to see that when we asked these questions, or I asked these questions of Nick Bowles, he managed quite deftly to sidestep those questions himself. Not about sustainability, but about the idea of calling in projects. Because once they're called in, once Mr. Pickles stands up, once a Secretary of State says, this will go ahead, there's no right of appeal. He's called it in. That's it. Game over. He's made his decision. And if we're interested in what he might be calling in, he's extended the definition to include things of business value. Wonderfully vague term, but effectively says if you are a developer and you want to go ahead and do something now, and there are people saying, hold on a minute, let's have a look at this, we have produced a local plan, we have addressed ourselves to some of these concerns, let's talk about whether this is going to be a good idea. The government has neatly put in a process whereby that can be sort of dismissed and can be turned on its head, and that voice, as it were, can be ignored. And it worries me. So on Monday, I found myself worried. Tuesday, I went then that evening to a meeting of the Hackney Empire. Now, I'm involved in this business altogether because I started as a fundraiser for the Hackney Empire in 1990. We were having a party that night to celebrate the fact that we had finally won a case against the insurers who had refused to pay up when the contractors went bankrupt. They'd now paid $1 million. We'd been able to pay Sir Alan Sugar back a loan that he'd made, and we could actually say after 23 years we had finally paid off the $25 million it cost to refurbish one building. One building that took me 23 years to raise the money for, and one building that effectively took 2 years to build in the first place. Now, people may see that as a sort of despairing story. It's a story which actually was hugely instructive to me. That's where I learned virtually everything that I know today about the relationships between councils and buildings and raising money and the processes that you have to go through. Almost completely irrelevant to Civic Voice, but it was an interesting journey for me. But I went there and I had another rather warm feeling towards volunteer people. The next day, we went down to Canterbury and I began my tour of Kent. When I went to Kent, I met people who had put together in Canterbury the vision for Canterbury. And I've written the introduction to that, and that is a fascinating document, because that is exactly what we were talking about with Nick Bowles. What we were talking about there is specifically localism at work. And why I salute it is because in the Hackney Empire, where, again, I got called a fair number of names for some of the things I did. And in Alton Water and Tattingston, I'm a little bit combative, if you like. One of the things that I'm doing all the time is fighting, standing up, getting publicity, trying to make a noise, and of course I wouldn't have been reported in any of the newspapers if I hadn't expressed fury, in inverted commas, at what was happening in Tattingston. If I just sort of done it in a rather sort of, as I was urged to do by various members of the committee, if I'd been a bit more rational about it, there would have been no publicity whatsoever in any papers whatsoever. So in a way, I have to take the rough with the smooth. I know that I can be a little bit arsey about things. I can, I like to get up and start making comments of one kind or another and annoying people. I think that's just what I'm there to do in a funny sort of way. But there's nothing annoying about the Canterbury Vision. What's brilliant about it, and to read it, and just to read it is to read an exemplary report on a town. It's a fascinating document. And it's good because it doesn't just talk about heritage. It talks about transport. It talks about green spaces. It talks about the nature of a nighttime economy. It talks about plans for affordable houses. In fact, it's an extremely balanced and intelligent document that looks in the face the problems that Canterbury, the city of Canterbury, has for the next 50 years as it adapts to more and more pressure here in the southeast of England. A pressure that everybody in the southeast of England is feeling and is in some ways very specific to Canterbury, because it also talks about the fact that they have a large transient population of students who occupy areas and then go away for the vacation and leave those areas, as it were, deserted at certain times. And they're just asking questions. They're asking the right questions. They're looking at the right issues. They're asking, if you like, all across the board, what should our concerns for our town be? When I started, as I say, in Civic Voice, I'd come from a tradition of heritage fighting, from the tradition of SAVE, from the tradition of John Betjeman, from the tradition of waving banners and standing up and calling people names, some of which I freely admit I still do. But what has been an education for me is to see a local plan put together, a neighbourhood plan, not a local plan but a neighbourhood plan, put together with such skill and judgment. I'm involved in forming a neighbourhood forum myself in the area that I live in, London, and I go to meetings in the neighbour's house. You'd be surprised, I also have a job. And, and I'm fascinated by the fact that we've involved ourselves in a colossal turf war before we started. Because I live in Fitzrovia, a very identifiable community area, which is divided by a long-standing political boundary between Camden and Westminster. And the people who are in Westminster won't join into the community forum around Fitzrovia because they will not be brought into the world of Camden, because Camden is a very badly run local authority and Westminster is a rather better run local authority, in their opinion. And so we've had to cross the Tottenham Court Road, and we've been involved most of the time in the early part of setting up this local plan in turf wars, in actually trying, again, brokering meetings between the Marylebone Association, who appear to have stolen a bit of Fitzrovia, and trying to get that bit of Fitzrovia back into the Fitzrovia Association, so the Camden Association. I mean, I'm thinking all the time, what are we doing? Come on, loves, get on with it. Look at Canterbury. They've already produced their vision for Canterbury, and what we're still doing is arguing to the satisfaction, I'm afraid, of the government. Because what I'm also aware of is the struggle between the Victorian Society, English Heritage, and the Bloomsbury Conservation Association was very much to the satisfaction of the British Museum. The struggle between bits of the Hackney Empire, the Friends of Hackney Empire, and the thing, all that is to the convenience of the council, who didn't want to get involved and wanted to cut the grant even further and basically get rid of the Hackney Empire and bulldoze it down. In other words, talking, making progress, getting forward, making some start in what we're trying to do, and not getting too bogged down in bureaucracy is something that I think is entirely important for the business of trying to work in these amenity groups, however difficult and unsatisfactory it may seem on the ground, to try and make peace with those people who are accusing you of not doing the right thing. Peace is very important if that battle wants to be won, because somewhere along the way we are talking about compromise. And compromise needn't necessarily be something which is as evil as we sometimes think. Because sometimes I feel that in this country the conservation lobby can spend a lot of time working on an individual building, but allow the rest of the place to fall into dereliction around it. One of our problems with listing and not enough conservation areas is that we tend to focus on individual buildings, architecture, bits of history, and not enough on the general region that we stay in. I mean, I'm interested in this whole region and this whole idea because of the work that I got involved in for Hackney Empire. Now, that was a focus. That was volunteer action, getting together with a theatre. I would never have done that with that theatre if that theatre was not already a thriving institution. I would never have got involved if somebody had said, I want to save this building, let's turn it into the theatre. The theatre was there. It already had the highest black audience and ethnic audience using that theatre in the whole of Britain. It was a community centre for for Hackney. One of the, well, officially, so I was told, I used to use this quite a lot when I was talking, one of the poorest boroughs in the bottom 10 poorest boroughs in Europe, Hackney. And when we went to the lottery to ask them for money, and I said, is it possible, you know, we're coming with our thing, they said, you're too poor to get money, I'm afraid. We don't think you will be able to raise the matching funds. I was astonished. This is what actually made me do it for 23 years. I was absolutely astonished. I could not believe that I was being told that because Hackney was impoverished, they would give money to the Royal Opera House, they would give money to Richmond, they would give money to places where they would find the matching money, but they felt that they couldn't at the time support the Hackney Empire because the people who lived around were too poor to support the theatre, even though they were using this theatre and it was falling around their heads. It was an extraordinary thing for me, and I needed to sort this out. But one of the things that I became aware of and worried by was the idea that because we were in Hackney, because we were in an area of transient population, because we were in an area of the immigrant population, because we were in an area of poor people who have other things to concern themselves with, if you like, than painting their front gate, as a result, most of the planning regulations were never enforced. The most hideous dereliction happened as a matter of course. If somebody wanted to stick up a billboard, they could stick up a billboard. If anybody wanted to leave a building half rotting, they would leave it half rotting. If they didn't want to work on their area and they didn't care to look after a falling down 18th century building, they could just let it fall down. And I was struck by the fact that we need. It's not necessarily a white, elitist, rich, middle-class thing to worry or to benefit from your environment. On the contrary, it's actually something that we all deserve. And in order to ensure that we all deserve it, it's something that needs to happen because the government sees it as important. And they see planning as something that can be used to effectively improve the environment for everybody. And one of the worst things, I think, about Britain at the moment is the way that anybody who stands up to say something ought to be done about this is treated as a sort of crackpot. Somebody who's treated as not only a crackpot, but doing it for entirely selfish reasons. If this were just true of the Guardian or the Morning Star, then in a funny way one could understand it. But it's actually an underlying idea that runs right the way through the broadsheets as well. The broadsheets, the Telegraph, that purports to support a campaign to save our when I said this thing about saving, the thing that runs a column written by Judith Woods saying that I'm a celebrity crackpot doing more harm than good. You go, oh great, okay, all right, thanks very much. That's really helpful, Daily Telegraph. So I'm conscious all the time that the issues that we're facing are issues, if you like, and what I'm learning more and more as I go through Kent and make one of these. I've been across East Anglia, and I've also been to Yorkshire and Derbyshire and into Nottingham on behalf of the Civic Trust to meet people. I'm conscious that these issues affect everybody. So the next day, we go to Ramsgate, and I go to Ellington Park. And there I meet people who are working in the small scale. They are these are local people who've decided to do something about their local park. They've stepped forward, they clear up the litter, they've planted the borders, they've tidied up the park, and they've taken over the running of their own park. And there are a number of volunteers. You have to go, it's just fantastic. It's just fantastic what they're doing. In a way, we all know how frustrating being involved in local plans and neighbourhood planning and trying to organise the whole town and run the universities, but how marvellous to see people doing just this simple thing and gaining for themselves a sort of therapeutic enjoyment out of doing it and a stake in what they are doing. And also they're saying to the rest of the population, it's not actually a question of letting everybody else do it for you. It's, you can do it yourself. You know, you don't actually, we have a sort of in Britain, a sort of idea that somehow the government needs to do that. The local authority needs to do that. In fact, we also need to think, no, I can do that. I'm signed up to a thing called the Litter Pledge, which is run by, and I thoroughly recommend it to everybody, it's run by a woman in Scotland, and she effectively, you sign a pledge which says you'll pick up 3 pieces of litter a week. That's it. That's all you do. That's your pledge. And you can pick them up anywhere you like or wherever you are. Like, but once you've signed the pledge, you're supposed to do it every day of your life. And I think, what a great idea. It's just, I mean, of course, in a funny way, it would probably irritate members of some local authorities because they don't, you know, they don't want people to do these things. They want to be able to pay people to do it. And we would love to be able for them to be able to pay people to do it. But in a sense, we're all conscious that litter needs picking up. This is a good way of doing it. So I've seen, as I've gone along, we went on to Ramsgate, we went on to Ramsgate and looked at another building where people are just starting what we've done with the Hackney Empire. And I'm there to say, go ahead, it's a hard and difficult road, but go ahead, it's something that can be achieved. And on restoration, we looked at, I don't know, 90 buildings, I think, and nearly all of them have found money and have been restored. It's not a sad case at all. It's actually, it's an extremely impressive record of people working through and getting those buildings going. And then I went to Faversham. I saw a town which effectively in Faversham has been a lot of it has been influenced and saved by the work that's been done by the local Amenity Society. There's been a tremendous amount of involvement from local people in the future of that high street, and what a fantastic thing that they did. How marvellous that they went in and saved Abbey Street. It's just, it's an impressive monument to the idea that caring and, in a way, getting involved is something that can have an action. But where is this all leading? What does this confusion, this not so much a lecture or a structure, where does this all leave? Where does this all take us? Where are we going with this? And the answer is this. What I've learned more than anything else is that there are local problems which relate to the locality that you live in. It's not, one size does not fit all. We do not have the same problems here in Rochester that they have in Bradford. We do not have the same problems that they have in Addingham or Bury St Edmunds. Close, but they won't be distinct. In Canterbury, here in Rochester, you probably don't have the same problem that they have in Canterbury with a transient student population. You have significant problems related to the locality. And those local problems need to be treated as local problems with the freedom and the interest from government to allow you to deal with them in local ways. At the moment, the planning legislation has effectively put one major plank introduced by the Treasury, which is that unless there is more construction, there will be no economic recovery. And to license that, we have to allow a free-for-all in planning. That planning has been deleterious to this country, that it's been a nuisance to business, and that it's got in the way. I happen to believe completely the opposite. That planning over the last 50 years has stopped the excesses of the 50s, of the 30s. I happen to live in central London. I chose at a very early age, once I left university, to start looking for places. I live on a sort of bollard in Oxford Street. And as far as I'm concerned, by living in the centre of London, I'm going there, and my parents' generation would have thought that was crazy, because the city, the middle of the city was polluted. It was, I mean, Matthew Paris, in an article the other day, pointed out, he said, as London used to be, there was a series of photographs, and he said, there we are, this shows those conservationists, look at it, it's filthy, covered in soot, the whole place is run down, there are piles of rubbish in the street. And you have to say, Matthew, the reason we don't have that anymore is because of concerned citizens standing forward and saying we cannot have this sort of level of pollution from coal fires, we must have a Clean Air Act. And the Clean Air Act meant we cannot have cars wandering, just driving around without silencers on them or pumping lead into the atmosphere. We have to do something about that. And as a result of doing something about that, we've made the cities somewhere that actually young people now want to live. They want to, and we had, of course we've been unable to move the planning, the regulations alongside the movements of populations, and we constantly revert to a sort of 1970s attitude in trying to look back to save instead of look to the future. But planning, regulation, the looking to the future is not, for me, about now. It's not about the past. It's not about regenerate. It's not about heritage. It's actually about the real future. It's about what we are going to leave for our grandchildren and their grandchildren. And we don't, if we make a mess now. Nick Bowles, God bless him, he seems a decent enough man, but he said a little while ago, we should take 10% of the countryside, we can easily afford it, and turn it over to housing. And you go, okay, 10%. The actual stated aim of solar parks is 2% of the country. How much of the countryside is being occupied by windmills and the new power lines to service those windmills? People are completely unaware that they have to run pylons now from the Wash, double-up pylons across Constable country and through the Scottish Highlands, huge runs to keep this green energy going. What are we going to lose in the next 10 years? 15%? Is that a conservative estimate? How many years, I'm not very good at maths, but how many years before 100% has gone at that rate? I don't imagine I'll live to see it, but even if I live another 25 years, we're talking about 50% of the countryside being wrecked or blighted in the name of this economic progress, in the name of our selfishness. It simply does not add up. And the only way to go forward is to look sensibly at the planning regulations and to grasp the nettle and do the right thing and put sensible planning in to control, organise and look at our infrastructure and ask yourselves and ask the whole community how we can arrange it so we are not profligate, so we don't waste our countryside and trash our country and destroy our towns into the bargain. It's actually a very important fight. It's difficult to take it out to people, I must admit. We're all accused of being old fogies. We're accused of somehow, as I say, looking after our own interests and, in effect, standing in the way. And one of the worst things that's happened is, to me, is the confusion that's come up in people's minds by the idea that we're all going to die in a terrible conflagration in the planet, and therefore that is enough to license anything. It's not. It's not enough to license bad planning and randomness driven by market greed and opportunism. Anyway, that sounds a bit bleak, doesn't it? But I've had a fantastic week in Kent, and I'm very pleased to be able to finish here and probably do... How long did I talk for? Oh, there we are, about an hour. I'm sorry about that. I was intending to talk for a lot less, but I wanted to go through my week to give you some idea of where I've been. I was astounded again that to meet so many people involved in doing so many different things. And I feel that if we're going to speak properly to Nick Bowles, and we're going to speak properly to Eric Pickles, and we're going to speak properly to David Cameron, it's really important that we go forth and we multiply. We have to find a bigger voice. We have to go through Civic Voice as our representative, and we have to reach out and get a bigger membership. We have to represent as many people as possible, and we have to alert them to the work that's done. I know that a lot of civic amenity societies do a lot of concentrated, focused work, some of which is very boring, looking at detailed planning permissions. And I hesitate to say to those people, you know, it's complicated, but you also have to do what the British Museum is doing, what the Royal Shakespeare Company and what the BBC is doing. you have to expand. You have to get bigger, you have to talk to more people, and if bringing them in as sharing your voice means they don't do anything except occasionally drink a glass of sherry or visit a building or attend an awards ceremony, you may think these things are sort of fripperies in your great struggle. But in fact, they're about saying to people, this matters, join us, have fun, let's all do this together and be aware of what's going on. Thank you very much.
I think you'd agree that's the most exciting Woolford lecture we've ever had. It's only the third.
Oh, exactly. No, there are lots to come.
Originally, when we were talking the other day, Griff said he'd be happy to answer any questions for a few minutes. Has anybody got any questions they want to put?
Could I suggest the next time you see Mr. Bowles that you point out to him the term NIMBY is usually used by people who wish to profit at other people's expense.
I think you're absolutely right. I'm astounded by how easily it's put around. I made the mistake of going on the internet this week quite a lot, just to try and sort a few things out. And it's amazing how common that phrase is, even by by quite standard and well-educated people. It's a crazy definition of people. If I go and protest against wind farms, as I have done recently in Argyll and Bute, I get called an interfering busybody. So one way or another, you can't win. But I guess we have to put up with that to a certain extent. I happen to believe, and I've said it on record, that we should be proud to be NIMBYs. There's nothing wrong with being an NIMBY. It's not a question of not in my backyard. It's my backyard. We live too often in this country assuming, in a way, that somehow it's somebody else's responsibility, nothing to do with us, that it's central government's. Well, we can see that central government is sort of lax in this business. It's the local authority, they should do something about it. Actually, it's our high street. It's our town. It's our environment. We need to be proud of saying, yeah, I'm concerned about it. I'm involved in it. I want to see what's going on.
Lady here.
You mentioned neighbourhood plans.
Yes.
Is it not just the parish councils that need to do them? Or can anybody do them?
Well, I think what's happening is
The local bill works through the national neighbourhood plan.
Yes.
And parish councils have the responsibility of doing that.
In some areas, the parish councils are leading the way, and parish councils effectively are doing them quite effectively across villages and so forth. But as I say, in larger cities, there's quite a turf war going on as to who should be involved. If you look at the outline details, the legislation, whenever it mentions the community, a word has been put in front of it by the Treasury, I think, the business community. And you go, okay. In fact, we are a community. My point, I was asked to address the West End Commission. My point is that we are, as a community, we involve a lot of people. And there are a lot of people with stakes in the environment, including small businesses and including residents who live there and including transitory population. And in a way, what we need to do is achieve a balance between them. And so those neighbourhood plans must be open to as many people to be asked and consulted and brought in as it's feasible, because it's no good, as so often with planning, it's a lot of it has to do with publicity and education. There's no budget being put together by the government to tell everybody that this is happening. And we need to tell everybody that this is happening.